All right, so welcome back to our weekly Tanya class. And today we're going to be doing just the parentheses at the end of chapter 10. The main text can be found at jewisharcadia.com/7889. So we're talking about the concept of B'nai Aliyah. We talked about last week how there's men of ascent. In other words, people of great stature, tzaddikim, righteous people who are not just any righteous person, but they are completely righteous, meaning they have totally eradicated their animal souls and not just eradicated it and extinguished it, but they actually transformed it to use that passion and energy for holiness and for godliness. And that's referred to Kabbalistically as B'nai Aliyah. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, actually, who was the author of the Zohar, famously we celebrate his yahrzeit on Lag BaOmer. So he said, B'nai Aliyah, men of ascent. In other words, there's two meanings of men of ascent. One is that they they do everything for the sake of the one on high. So, in other words, it's not men of ascending, but men of elevation. In other words, everything's done for the one above. And another meaning is that they ascend everything, meaning they cause everything to go up to holiness. So over here, we're introducing a very interesting and actually common Hasidic and Kabbalistic concept called Mayin Nukvin and Mayin Dechurin. Mayin in Aramaic is similar to the Hebrew, which is Mayim, water. So we're talking about feminine waters and masculine waters. It's important to understand that the relationship between God and the Jewish people is often referred to as a male-female relationship. We know this from the book of Shir HaShirim, the book of Song of Songs, that it was actually the last book of the Bible, of the Tanakh, to be canonized. It was written by King Solomon as a metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. And in that book, God is referred to as the groom, and the Jewish people are referred to as a bride. And it's basically a romantic story of God's love for the Jewish people, and vice versa. Actually, there was some controversy. Some of the sages said, we can't include this in the, official script of the written Tanakh. But Rabbi Akiva said, all the other books are holy, but this book is holy of holies. Why? Because this is intimacy. Just like we know in Judaism, the holiest act, the holiest mitzvah that a person could do on this world is the act of a marital union, of husband and wife being intimate together for the right purpose, for the right cause of building the foundation of a Jewish home. This is the holiest thing. So the book of Shir HaShirim is a metaphor for the relationship between God and the Jewish people. So in that metaphor, God is the groom, the Jewish people are the bride, and we'll see how this plays into this discussion over here of the complete tzaddik and his relationship with Hashem and all that. So we're up to the parentheses at the end of chapter 10. The Alter Rebbe begins with Shneim Oilim B'Kana Echad, and both of these things fit in one channel. In one kana could mean like a stick. So we're basically explaining how Kabbalistically the two sides of the same coin of why B'nai Aliyah, men of ascent, are given that title, which is number one, because they transform the evil of the animal soul and they transform it to good and they elevate it to holiness. And number two, because they do Torah mitzvahs, they do Va'asei Tov, they do good deeds for the sake of the one on high. In other words, in order that godliness should be revealed into the lower world. So both of these elements of doing things for God and transforming the animal soul are really two sides of the same coin. In other words, they're not two separate services, two separate paths in divine service that are disconnected with one another, but on the contrary, they're actually dependent on one another. Um, because the ability to be able to draw down God's holiness into the lower realms by doing Torah and mitzvahs is dependent on the process of transforming and elevating evil into good. So to understand this, he's going to explain briefly, but Kabbalistically, how the job of transforming evil into good and elevating it into holiness is what causes um, the doing good of doing Torah and mitzvahs to bring godliness into this world. So this is what the Alter Rebbe goes on to explain. Ki al yedei haberurim shemevarim minayga. By the purifications that we purify and we sift through from the shining klipa. So in other words, in Kabbalah it explains that the main purpose of humankind here in this world is to be mevarer berurim, which is literally to refine refineries. In other words, there's a shining aspect of klipa. There's klipa is generally referred to as things that are opposing godliness, but it could also be things that are somewhat translucent and blocking godliness, but you could still see the godliness shining through it. So we talked about this at great length in chapter 7 of Tanya, how the life force of everything that you're allowed to do in this world, like kosher pizza and kosher ice cream, and anything else that's kosher and fit for a Jew to engage in, but not necessarily holy activities, that is something that we call a shining klipa. Because on the one hand, it's getting its life force from the side of negativity, meaning that the passion and the lust and desire for these kind of things doesn't come from a holy place. But on the other hand, it's not pure evil. So it has a mixture of good and bad. And the person's job is to refine this activity and to bring out the good in it and to elevate it to something holy. So like music is not kosher or unkosher, but to take music and utilize it for something holy and to bring out a passion and excitement about a mitzvah, or to bring joy on a Jewish holiday, or to bring joy to a Jewish wedding or something like that, that is taking something like music, which is neither here nor there, and you're now elevating it in and making it into something holy. And that's our job in this world. You know, angels don't have clarinets and they don't have pianos, but we have those gifts. And those gifts are klipas noga. They're a shining klipa. They're a little bit of good, a little bit of evil. They could be used for either one. And our job in this world is to refine all of these things and make them shine. So when we do that, and here's the Kabbalistic terminology, Ma'ilim Mayin Nukvin, we are elevating feminine waters. So the Zohar explains that when there is an arousal from below, it causes an arousal above. In other words, when a human being here in this world arouses himself and brings and initiates closeness to God, and again, this mirrors human relationships too. When there's two spouses and one initiates intimacy with the other, and then the other one responds in kind, it's a mutual relationship. So when the human down here initiates coming close to God, that causes in turn a divine nurturing and beneficence that's given from above to us. The Gemara says actually that Adam mekadesh atzmei momata mekadshin oisei momayla. A person sanctifies himself below, and they sanctify him in turn from above. So we initiate and God responds in kind. And so that's the non-Kabbalistic, the Talmudic way of wording it. But in the Arizal, who was a famous Kabbalist from the 15th century in Tzfat, the way he wrote it is that this is elevating feminine waters or drawing down masculine waters. So what does that mean? Masculine and feminine in Kabbalistic terms are really metaphors for nurturer and receiver, or nurturer and developer. The man is considered the nurturer and the woman is considered the receiver. And the same is true in regards to the relationship between God and the Jewish people, that God is considered the Chatan, the groom, the man, and the Jewish people are considered the woman, the Kala. And so feminine waters are the powers of the receiver, of the Jewish people. And the idea of elevating feminine waters means that the Jewish people here in this world serve God and elevate things upward and cause a nachas, they cause pleasure to God. And that's what it means to elevate feminine waters. Now, what is masculine waters? That is God's ability to nurture us and to sustain us and to give us beneficence. And so when we say drawing down masculine waters, that is all of these beneficences, the spiritual vitality coming from above down to the Jewish people. And that comes again as a response and as a result of the Jewish people, quote unquote, elevating their feminine waters. And so this is what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, that through the Jewish people doing these birurim, doing these rectifications, these refinements in this world, meaning to seek out the good into every worldly pleasure or worldly permissible things and elevating those activities into holiness, that causes the elevation of feminine waters. In other words, that is our expression of arousal and coming close to God. V'nasim yichudim el yainim. And through this, it causes this is a very Kabbalistic terminology. Yichudim means unities, el yainim means above. So there are upper unities that take place when we initiate the closeness and the elevation of the feminine waters. So what's this upper unity that we're talking about? So what that means is there's a combination, there's a unity and connection of various different sphero, different divine attributes, which although naturally they are opposite from one another, and there's no connection between them. For example, God's midah of chesed, of kindness, is the opposite of God's element of gevura, of severity. And they normally don't coexist. Again, on some level, of course, everything is just one. But in a certain level of expression of godliness, chesed and gevura are opposites. So when the Jewish people do what they have to do here, it arouses this upper unity, meaning that chesed and gvura and other such sphirot, which are normally opposite from one another, should be able to combine with each other. So in other words, in order to combine chesed and gvura, which are naturally opposites, you have to have a force that's greater than both of them to really combine them together. It's kind of, this is my own analogy, but it's kind of like when two siblings are fighting and they're not getting along with one another, comes the parent into the picture and says like, we are all one family, we are one. We're not against each other, we're all on the same team. So when chesed and gvura, so to speak, are in conflict with one another, there has to be a greater force, a more supernal and greater, more spiritual light and force that imbues a sense of unity between them. Now, what causes that higher light? That's initiated by the elevation, so to speak, of the feminine waters, that the Jewish people arouse God to feel this way and to cause that upper unity. And now there's many unities that happen in these upper realms because there's 10 Sefirot and there's 4 different worlds. There's really 40 different levels. So there's all sorts of unities, and things that are otherwise separate from each other suddenly start connecting, and the chesed gives into gvura, and gvura into teferes, and this world into the next world. It's a whole complicated map. But the bottom line is, ultimately, as he says next, laherid mayin dechurid, it brings down the masculine waters, because all of these sefirot, all of these spiritual levels are really just givers and receivers. And there's a pattern of giver to receiver, giver to receiver, giver to receiver, down and down until it finally reaches us. So this whole process of divine vitality or divine energy reaching us ultimately is initiated by our divine service. By our elevation of the feminine waters, we cause in turn that God draws down the masculine waters, so to speak, towards us. Which are the waters of kindness within every positive mitzvah of the 248 positive commandments, which all of those are the idea of kindness and masculine waters. So the whole idea of bringing down masculine waters, which is initiated by elevating the feminine waters, that is the waters of kindness that exists in every mitzvah. So the word chesed, which means kindness, is the idea of nurturing, the idea of giving, which is a masculine quality. So every mitzvah of the positive mitzvahs has a specific channel of kindness and of nurturing, which means that through the fulfillment of the 248 positive commandments, we bring down these divine kindnesses, which are in Kabbalistic terms, in Arizal's terminology, this is what we're referring to as masculine waters. And it all comes as a result of our doing mitzvahs and elevating, so to speak, metaphorically, those feminine waters. Dahainu hamshachas kedushas elikusa yisbarich momayla lamata, which means, in more commonly used terminology, bringing down the holiness of God from above to below, leislabish batachtainim, to come down into this lowly world, as is explained in other sources in Hasidus and Kabbalah. So the whole idea of these waters of kindness, or masculine waters in the performance of mitzvahs, which brings down godliness from above to below, is because whenever we do any of the 248 positive commandments, we bring the light of infinity, the light of God, here into this world. And as we're going to explain later in Tanya in chapter 37, I think also a little bit in 33 and 34, that the whole purpose of God creating the world is to make a dwelling place for God in this world. So, in other words, God doesn't want to use a metaphor from hockey, God doesn't want to throw slap shots into an open cage. He wants to throw slap shots into a small net with a big goalie blocking the way, and to squeak it into those holes that are very difficult to get into. In other words, for God to shine into the realm of the spiritual world, like Atzilus, and where all the angels hang out, that's no big deal. That's an open cage. They're ready, willing, and able to receive godliness. But the whole idea is to bring godliness into this world, where there's, so to speak, a goalie blocking the net. There's all sorts of physical appearances that scream and say, no, this is not godliness. I see a book, I see a table, I see a piece of metal over here. I don't see godliness. That's the goalie, so to speak, blocking divinity from entering this world. And our job is to score the goals for God and to bring godliness here into this world. So, just to summarize what we discussed today, which is that we explained there's two meanings in the words B'nai Aliyah, men of elevation or men of ascent. One is that, which is a reference to complete tzaddikim, the tzaddik omer, the absolute tzaddik. So one meaning is that the tzaddik omer has completely transformed the evil in his soul to goodness and elevated that evil into holiness. And number two, that they do all of their Torah and mitzvahs for the purpose of the one above. And these two sides are really two sides of the same coin, because by doing the work of transforming evil into good, that actually is precisely what makes a dwelling place for God. It's precisely what brings godliness into these lower worlds. And that's based on what's explained in Kabbalah, that this idea of transforming evil into good and bringing it up to holiness, that is the elevation of the feminine waters, which causes upper unities, and through that it draws down kindness and light from God's supernal kindness down into this world, and this idea of bringing godliness into this world and making this world a dwelling place for God. So ultimately what we're saying is we're using a metaphor from human relationships of masculine and feminine, that when we do our part in doing the mitzvah, that causes God to do his part and shine his kindness to us, but not just his kindness, but his very presence to dwell in this world, which ultimately is something that he's not even doing it for us. We benefit from it, of course, but that was his own selfish desire from the get-go. This is why he created the world in the first place. The purpose was to have the thrill of scoring a goal on a blocked cage, on a very difficult place to get into a world that doesn't allow godliness to get in naturally, and we have to do the hard work of bringing that godliness into this world. And that is the conclusion of chapter 10 of Tanya. And next week we move on to more exciting subjects in chapter 11, and that is talking about the Rasha, the evil person, or the person who has evil, and we'll get into the different categories of that in next week's class.